welcome everybody to this event. And to say that I am Danielle Kinkel, Faculty Director of the Rappaport Center. And it's a pleasure to see all the people in the room and see the millions of people who are online who are now streaming into the room. Okay, so our senior fellow is Danielle Kinkel, who's been the General Counsel of the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, a quasi-state agency for 4 years. This is a self-supporting public nonprofit organization that works with communities to create innovative policy and financing solutions that provide affordable homes and better lives for the people of Massachusetts. Using funds from the banking industry to provide long-term loans for affordable rental housing. Since 1990, MHP has provided over $1 billion with a B in loans and commitments that has financed over 22,000 units of multifamily rental housing. Additionally, MHP advises local communities on how to build affordable housing through providing technical assistance on various state, federal, and local subsidies and programs. The first-time homebuyer programs, which are formerly known as Soft Second and now known as One Mortgage, have leveraged over $4 billion in private financing to help over 18,000 low and moderate income families purchase their first home. So you can see we're in good hands for a moderator, and as you'll hear in a minute, we're in excellent hands for a panel. I think there's a lot to learn about this, and we have the right people to tell us about it. Danielle was also a real estate lawyer for a decade at a boutique law firm. She's active in multiple housing organizations and committees, including the Boston Bar Association, the American Bar Association, the Real Estate Bar Association, and CHAPA, which
Citizens Housing and Planning Association.
the Citizens Housing and Planning Association. I apologize to all the CHAPA devotees. She's a graduate of the University of Michigan, has a master's degree in education from Boston College and a law degree from Northeastern. Please welcome her here, and then we'll welcome the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thanks again for coming to listen to this panel. Excited to hear your questions and catch up with you after an office hours today and whenever you'd like to reach out. So as you put this, I have very capable hands, but I'm going to send the introductions to each one of my panelists so that you get to hear a little bit more from them. So I'm going to start with you, Dariella. Can you offer just a couple seconds on who you are and what you do in the affordable housing space?
Of course. Thank you, Danielle, for having me here today. My name is Ariella Dionmaga. I'm a lifelong resident of Boston. I have deep roots in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, given that I grew up in several affordable housing developments in those communities. I'm also the founder and president of Danielle Consulting. We're a Boston-based firm that is focused on developing affordable housing, providing real estate development services, and also marketing income-restricted opportunities in the communities that I mentioned. We achieve this by providing real estate. We bring a community-centered approach to every aspect of our work. That's how we set ourselves apart from more traditional developers and marketing agents.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for participating. Kathleen Evans.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you to BC for having us here today. My name is Kathleen Evans. I'm the Product and Lending Analytics Manager at Mass Housing, which is the state housing finance agency for another of the quasi-public agencies in Massachusetts. In my role at Mass Housing, I primarily work on rental housing, the development and preservation financing of affordable rental housing. But we also run the Commonwealth Builder Program, which is a subsidy program aimed at creating and incentivizing the supply of income-restricted ownership units in communities disproportionately impacted by COVID, the so-called gateway cities in Boston.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Emilio Dorsally.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Emilio Dorsally. I'm the CEO. Urban is a nonprofit organization commonly known as a development corporation. And generally, when we say that, it does mean that we're a nonprofit that actually does some business-related activities, such as building affordable housing and working with small businesses and a whole range of other things. But when I think about Urban Edge, and we've been around for close to 50 years, and we're located in Roxbury, and we started because of the red line. Years in the late 60s, early 70s, when the organization, before it was formed, community members in JP, Eggleston, and Parker Roxbury were trying to stop the highway. And years later, here we are, still trying to make sure that the impact of what happened allows people to have affordable homeownership and affordable rentals. We work on all types of projects, small to 200 unit building. And we're excited to really talk about this important issue that many people in our community have talked about the importance of it.
Thanks so much. And she probably doesn't need an introduction, but she'll do it anyway. Professor Alexander.
Hi, well, thank you so much, Danielle Rappaport Center, for having me on this panel. I'm Professor Lisa Alexander. I'm one of the new professors here at Boston College Law School, but I've been a professor. I've been a professor for 16 years though, and I have affordable housing in New York myself. I have been an owner and a renter and a landlord, and I teach courses here in housing law and policy at BC. I also teach corporations and I teach local government law. And prior to being a professor, I actually worked as an affordable housing field lawyer in a bunch of different environments and a fair housing lawyer.
Thank you so much, and so grateful to have all of you here. So let's get started. Again. I mean, I can just go from here. It's okay, I can just. We'll just do this, okay. Great, so I wanted to just remind everyone, and especially those who weren't able to join the conversation on Monday, that we're here talking about affordable homeownership. As Dan said earlier, the Rappaport Center is really focused on cutting edge public policy issues and hopefully solutions. And as critical as affordable housing is and how much time we've all spent on it, homeownership issues, affordable homeownership issues are really kind of the cutting edge in the, as I think of it, in the affordable housing industry. This is an area that we haven't spent very much time talking about, which is why I wanted to spend some time talking about it this week, which is why we're going to hear about it today. It's something new that Urban Edge is working on, Dariella is working on, Kathleen as well. So it's really critical to understand that affordable homeownership is part of the bigger system. We aren't talking about homeownership replacing a different kind of affordable housing or supportive housing idea or solution. Every single piece of the puzzle is critical. We need to address each individual piece from a lot of different areas. So today, when we're talking about affordable homeownership, that's in addition to affordable rental multifamily housing, that is in addition to emergency shelters and homelessness issues. And also really important to think about it, again, from Monday, we're talking about homeownership from an equity lens and how there has been unequal and inequitable access to homeownership opportunities over the decades. So that's why we are having this conversation today. So just another reminder that we'll be talking about this both from the supply angle and the demand angle. Again, we really need to be thinking about how can we just boost the supply in the Commonwealth? What are the many different ways that folks like Emilio and Dariella can continue to build more housing out there? But then also on the demand side, on the direct assistance, the direct support to home buyers, how can we help all of you, anybody out there, with purchasing an affordable homeownership unit, condominium from, Dariella or Emilio, or go out into the market to find a reasonably priced property. Okay, so just wanted to let you know that we're going to start from the supply side and then move on to the demand side through this conversation. Okay, and I'm going to pause my slides at this point. And as we get into this, I'm going to ask Lisa to start us off with a quick refresher on how our existing zoning laws and single family zoning have kind of gotten us to a place of unaffordability in homeownership. So I'm going to do some technology movement here. And here we go. I think it's gonna be.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much for doing this panel. So affordable home ownership might seem like a contradiction at this point, particularly in Boston. And a little bit of what I'm going to talk about, really my co-panelists have so much more on the ground experience in Boston as to how we deal with this problem. But I'm providing a bit of the history here, right? So my goal is to talk first about maybe just some national trends, a couple of points on that, about the extreme racial homeownership gaps that exist both nationally and in Massachusetts, and particularly in Boston. A little bit about why that is, and then to talk about zoning, as Danielle said, what zoning got to do with it. And then after my other panelists share their observations, thoughts, and experience, I may talk a little bit about my research on tiny homes and how it contributes to this discussion. So, okay, here's a slide. Home prices and apartment rents nationally, this is data from 2021, are up, right? So the bottom darker red line is apartment rents, and the yellow line are home prices. So even with the pandemic, even with all of this, home prices have been up. Additionally, what's happening nationally is that private equity investors, those are, institutional investors, have been buying up large amounts of single family homes. So whereas single family homes might be owned traditionally by one family who's then going to sell their home to another family, we have lots of large institutional investors who are now buying up these homes, and their purpose in buying it is to make money, right, off of these investments, and that has had a contribution to making prices go up. So as a result, the home ownership rate in the US has fluctuated from the 1990s to 2022. And you see the height of it happening really before the housing crisis and the Great Recession of 2008, where everybody was buying homes, everybody could be a homeowner, seemed like it was all great, and then we had a recession. I'm sharing my screen with people who aren't in the room. So right now it's about at 75%. But it basically is, it fluctuates, right? What I hope you can see, I think this is not, the display settings. No, it's not display settings. Okay, so what's true? Yep. Yeah, now that changed me, it goes in. Oh, sure. Okay, so great. So these are racial home ownership rates, right? And the top line is the white home ownership rate, which if we look in about 2022 is about at a high of 75%, right? In the home ownership rate for white households was 75% compared to about 45% for Black households, which is the lowest of all, and about 48% for Hispanic Latinx households, and about 57% for what on this slide they call other, which is annoying because they're talking primarily about Asian families, right, in the yellow line. So the fact is that Black, Hispanic, and Asian homeownership rates are substantially below white homeownership rates, even though there have been slight increases in the Asian rate and the Latino rate, but the Black rate has actually been quite low. And in fact, despite the enactment of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, in about 1920, the Black homeownership rate was lower than it was before the Fair Housing Act was enacted, right? So it's been substantially low, and that has to do with the Great Recession, the pandemic, and some other things, but it's pretty low. This is more specific data from Boston, comparing the national rates to Boston. So within the Boston metro area, the white rate is about 70%. The Asian rate is about 57%. And in the Boston metro area, the Hispanic rate is quite low at 31%, and the Black rate is at 37%. Okay, so significant disparities, and these price pressures that I showed you slides about in the beginning have just exacerbated this problem. The housing cost increases have really reduced the pool of potential home buyers in Boston specifically. Okay, so why is that? How did we get here? Why are there these substantial home ownership rates? Often people, when they talk about housing, think, oh, housing markets just kind of happen. People just sort of live where they can afford to live. And, they just sort of make choices in housing placements on who owns homes and who's a homeowner. It's just a result of those choices. Not so. Law and public policy have shaped housing markets historically, really from the beginning of the 18th century, but particularly since 1933, right? The law and policy has played a role. And there's a set of laws specifically that are racist housing policies. And the reason I say racist is not, to make people feel uncomfortable or feel bad, because the laws themselves were specifically racist, right? They basically allocated housing opportunities based upon race and not based upon class. So coming out of the Depression in 1933, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was established to assist homeowners coming out of the Depression to be able to, or who were defaulting on their mortgages and to end in foreclosure. And they were designed to help provide mortgage insurance to help make mortgage rates lower so that more people could buy homes, because prior to these changes, the interest rates on mortgages were quite high. In the Federal Fair Housing Administration in 1934, also began insuring home mortgages, as I said. And what was true was that when they made these loans, they were primarily making this insurance only for white homeowners. And that was not based on your income in the sense of, okay, maybe more Black homeowners were not as wealthy, so that was why they did it. Irrespective of your income, if you were not white, if you were not white, you could not basically get one of these loans. This was exacerbated again in 1938 with the Federal National Home Mortgage Association, Fannie Mae, with the securitization of loans and making them available more widely in markets. That was also a racist program. And finally, the GI Bill, which provided former military individuals who were coming back from the war the opportunity to own homes and to have subsidies from the federal government to make homes more affordable. Those were also denied to Black people based on race. And then you all have heard about redlining. I want to say something very quickly about it, is that this was a system of redlining that was based on maps, right? Where the reason that you would not be able to get an opportunity based upon your race is because the area in which large numbers of people of color lived were on a map coded as bad areas that were red, and areas that were predominantly white were considered the best, they were green, and areas that had other kinds of individuals in between, which were thought to be risky mortgage renter, risky credit locations, were marked yellow and blue. So if we look at Boston, right, and the screen isn't going to show it as clearly here, there are yellow and red areas. So if we just take a chance to look at Newton on my slide, we're sitting, is this red pointer work? It's not good. I wanted the red pointer to work. So we're sitting in, so I have to walk through area. Sorry, I have to walk through here. So this area, because my pointer won't work, is basically Chestnut Hill. This is a little bit of the country club area, and this is Chestnut Hill, Newton up here. The area that we're sitting in is primarily green, but there's a few blue areas. And the reason they're blue, sadly, is that under this system of allocation, individuals who were Jewish, although they were white, were actually considered risks. So your area, if you had significant numbers of Jewish individuals living there, was considered still desirable, but not the best area. And so in Newton, where we were sitting, most of the areas are green, but areas where there were significant numbers of Jewish individuals were considered blue. If we go over to Roxbury, Dorchester, there were only at the time in Roxbury something like 5% of Black people lived there. And apparently in the broader Dorchester area, only 25% of Black people live there. And yet on my map, if you look at the Dorchester area, the entire area is red. Bad, problematic. And therefore, banks did not want to lend to individuals who lived in those areas to become homeowners. And it started a cycle of disinvestment. These maps built on the racism that was already there, but it also exacerbated it. So if you were white and you didn't have a problem with anybody who lived next to you who happened to be of color, you had no incentive to go buy a house near them because your house is going to be devalued, right? So this history I mentioned because the topics that we're talking about today deal with this history, right? We're now trying to find home ownership opportunities for people that were made renters because of housing policy, right? Could not be homeowners, could not therefore live in Newton. And then when their kids got older, sell the house to their kids, and then their kids could buy in Newton. They were relegated to this area. A couple other things that happened, and then I'm ending my history lesson, is that the American Housing Act of 1949 then further exacerbated those initial problems because the system was a system where it would greatly expand the federal government's role in housing, and there was significant money to use eminent domain to clear slums. So the areas that had been designated slums based on the maps that the federal government created in concert with real estate entities, then were considered bad areas that needed to be cleared due to eminent domain. So the individuals living in those areas would have their homes taken over by eminent domain, which we should know from property means that you should have just compensation, but none of those people got just compensation, right? Which is well empirically documented. And then they were moved out of those areas for highways that were then built in 1956. And in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was supposed to help us remedy this history of racist policies. But as I said, the homeownership rate, the Black one at least, is as low as it was before that act, right? Okay, so that's my little history lesson. And the last point I wanted to make, which I've been asked to talk about, is what zoning got to do with it. Well, now we don't have facially racial housing policies anymore. They're not allowed. But this legacy persists through zoning. Zoning is basically the ability to plan uses of land within a given area. And it's something that each locality gets to wield based on its police power, right? And there were a series of laws that basically said that zoning was okay. The idea is that you have a zoning map and you identify different uses that can be together. Single family homes that might be next to a mixed use, which might be far away from a grocery store or an industrial site, and you identify uses. Zoning had originated in the United States, and it was in 1922 that the Standard Zoning Enabling Act made zoning a power that localities could wield, and Euclid case in 1926 said that that was fine. There were a couple of other key zoning I just want to show you. But the point is that over time, zoning moved from something where we just put together incompatible uses to a complete embrace of single family zoning as our primary zoning mechanism, where all homes were encouraged, in many localities were encouraging only single family homes with large lots, with lots of space in between them. And that has now in Boston made the cost of housing really unaffordable for everyone, not just people of color, but people of color also feel that most pronouncedly because of zoning. So zoning is not facially racial, but the decision to say that we want large lots, we don't want multifamily housing, we don't want dense creative housing has exacerbated this problem in the present. So I think that's it.
I'm going to keep this up because I'm going to have to very quickly. So this issue of single family zoning, right? You may have noticed in the news and a discussion and the passage of something called the MBTA Communities Act. And this is a critically important tool and new way of approaching zoning and addressing the single family zoning issue. So in the Commonwealth here, there have been several communities identified as MBTA communities around transit nodes, and there are different requirements based on the spheres around that transit node, but it is requiring that around those transit nodes, multifamily housing zoning is now required. And well, I should say, required as our Attorney General Danielle Kinkel said recently last week, and so we'll be seeing that in the news quite a bit. But we now have a new zoning law that tells us that multifamily zoning must be encouraged and must occur. And so I want to turn it back to you, Lisa, because I want to hear everyone to hear a little bit more about, now that we have some new zoning requirements, what are some sort of new products or new ideas that we could start to do now that the law is allowing it? Yeah, great.
Okay, so I guess then I felt zoning motivation, but I have another Danielle a great talk on Monday, which shows the different types of housing that one has to think about when we're talking about affordable housing, right? And we're really in the space between You know, affordable home ownership is right before market rental and market home ownership. And the idea is, can we create forms of housing that are more dense, that are therefore cheaper to build, and therefore the cost of those homes will be less to the people who seek them out. And it's a challenge, particularly in Boston, as these panelists will attest, because land costs here are particularly high because of the zoning, because we have also lots of parks and nice spaces for us to go run around the reservoir, and therefore you can't build on those spaces. So the available land to build is not a lot, and the costs of building on that land are significant. Additionally, what's interesting is because of fractionated title, a bunch of other challenges and problems in the disinvested areas I talked about in places like Roxbury or Dorchester, those areas, land costs can actually be quite high in those areas as well. And it can be a real challenge to figure out how to develop a project that is affordable, even in an area that has been disinvested, right? So those zoning challenges are significant. Mayor Wu's administration has dealt with that. One of the things that I've written about a little bit are tiny homes. And I've written about them in a very specific context, really the utilization of tiny homes for people who have been formerly unhoused or are homeless, and the ways in which tiny homes might be able to be used to mitigate the problems of housing that population. However, tiny homes are defined as homes that are usually under 400 square feet. And that can apply to anybody. It doesn't just have to apply for homeless individuals. But the fact is that most dwelling codes in most jurisdictions nationally define a resident or a dwelling or a unit as 400 square feet or more. And tiny homes are less than that. So in most places, tiny homes are not legal. It's only in jurisdictions that have made changes to their zoning codes to allow for something that we call accessory dwelling units, which are slightly smaller units that might be in the backyard, like the grandma flat in the backyard that's a little less than 400 square feet, or whom have changed their zoning code to allow for things that are smaller. What's great about tiny homes from a cost perspective is that if you use the right, you can use pretty good materials, you can use pretty sustainable materials, and you can put them up pretty quickly and pretty fast if you can get the land on which to build them, right? So they're cost effective. They can also be more sustainable because they have less of an environmental footprint. And they also can be more affordable because there's less square footage, so you pay less per square foot, so you're not paying as much for that. Many jurisdictions that have had significant housing challenges, like in California, Portland, Washington, particularly areas in the West Coast that also have space, have turned to tiny homes as an affordable homeownership alternative, right? They were really cool, like in 2015 when there was an HGTV show about them and stuff like that. But they've also been used for homeless people as a way for them to have a place to lock the door, not be in shelters, and particularly during the pandemic, they were extensively used. This have to change to accommodate tiny homes villages, and different jurisdictions have used different creative opportunities for this. Some places have created them as transitional housing. So on that spectrum that Danielle had up, they're on the far end for transitional housing for homeless people, and they've created special zoning designations to allow them to be in units that are like 100 square feet or less. And other places have changed it to be a different iterations. I just wanted to show some examples. In different places, you have different types of tiny homes. So in Austin, Texas, for example, where there's a lot of land outside of the boundaries of Austin, the zoning is not as extensive. There's a huge master plan community that serves something like 2,000 different formerly homeless individuals, all kinds of different arrangements of tiny homes and RVs and TP huts and villages living together in communal spaces. And I've written extensively about that. That's a picture of me and my daughter at the Austin Tiny Home Village doing like cleanup and stuff and sort of hanging out with the people who now live there. And it's this very amazing, productive community of formerly unhoused people that live in very productive relationships, doing jobs, work. They work in car development organizations, artists and stuff, etc. This is just an example of the site map of how many different units they've been able to put up. And some people, most people on this unit rent them. They're renters, and the rent that they pay is less than the average market rate rent in Austin because of the small nature of the homes. It's only like $250 because it's 250 square feet. But in other jurisdictions like Detroit, people have used this for homeownership. So there are individuals who have smaller homes in lots in Detroit. They will rent them for perhaps 5 years and then eventually become owners of those lots as well. So this has become an alternative. In many locations, I just wanted to mention that here in closing, that in Boston, we actually have examples of this ourselves. In Shattuck Hospital, in order to deal with the mass and caste homelessness problem that we have here in Boston, they created a small tiny homes village called the Cottages at Shattuck. This is a Boston Public Radio story about it. And a former individual who actually had struggles with addiction, but was saying that being part of this community, having a place to lock and shut the door, and also having the services that are being created has helped them to find stabilization that might move them further along the ladder to homeownership. And that's just an example of it. Okay, so with that was.
Oh my. Okay, wow, thank you so much. It's really exciting, and thanks for ending on this local story here, because that is really exciting. I wasn't aware of that. Okay, so just okay, all right. So I'm gonna urge all of you to go back and watch my presentation from Monday if you wanted to see anything more about some of that history that Professor Alexander was talking about. I spent some time going through many of the items that she talked about, as well as this slide. Okay, so we just talked about zoning reform. And we've been talking a lot about this and these wonderful ideas like tiny homes and some innovation that we could really be thinking of. But I also want to turn it over to Dariella and maybe talk a little bit about, if we have this idea and we wanted to move it forward, can you give us a little bit of your background and experience on community engagement, and as a developer kind of needing to bring ideas to the community in order to get them done? How do we do that, and how could we do that going forward?
I think for us, community engagement is at the center of all the work that we do. I think we've been successful in that because I'm very open about my story. And I think I'm open about it because I think it's important to change the face of what affordable housing residents look like and what affordable home buyers look like. I've gone through the entire cycle that you saw up on screen, from homeless to home buyer. That's my story. So I think we've been able to sit down and have real conversations with residents about what it takes to get from rental to homeownership. We've been able to also change the language that we use around affordability. I think affordability, if you notice, I talk about income restricted housing. I think affordability is something that is relative, and it really depends on who you're talking to. So it's important for us to talk about income restricted and also demystify that a little bit. What does it mean? Who are the folks that qualify for affordable homeownership? Many of you in this room qualify for affordable homeownership in Boston. I don't necessarily think folks in our community understand the broad spectrum of incomes that actually can enter homeownership. So we spend a lot of time talking about what are those incomes and who are the folks that are filling the jobs. We're talking about teachers, social workers, all not essentially very low income people. I think with affordability, with the word affordable, I think there is this preconceived sort of negative notion around who are the folks that live in affordable housing. And the only way that we can move past that is by having those real conversations about what the real affordability crisis is in Boston right now. It's not just about ELI, it's also about workforce folks, right? It's also about people that are your peers, are your coworkers that can't qualify for to be homeowners, or can't get into the market, right? To market rate homeownership. So I think we spend a lot of time talking to neighborhood associations about it, not just when we're developing projects, but constant. It's a constant conversation with I live in the communities that we develop as well. So it's a constant conversation about what does that mean? If we allow for more density, who can come here? It could be your daughter, it could be your grandma who's never been able to own before. So it's really about making it personal and helping folks understand that we are here all the way through the process of developing. So I think that's we've made a lot of strides with communities that we work with, bringing it really down to the human level.
Thanks so much. And I'm curious, is the conversation that you're hearing in communities different when you're talking about affordable rental housing, for example, versus affordable homeownership projects? And I'll say it again, Darielle, Emilio, the work they're doing, they are some of the few who have been involved in recent affordable homeownership development. So do you see a difference there?
Yeah, for sure. I think there is a push, right? I think every meeting that I'm in, they're talking about homeownership, right? Because the conversation is, how do we close the wealth gap in Boston? My neighbors know that homeownership is one of those ways, right? That's how I did it. That's how many of them have done it as well. So I think the conversation, especially in communities like Roxbury, where there is, you know, a large, and Emilio can speak more to this, but there's a large amount of income restricted rental housing and not as much access to affordable homeownership. So Roxbury specifically is very focused on how do we bring more affordable homeownership options, and they're actually advocating for it when it comes to community meetings around development. So this is very much at the top of the list for community members.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so that's exciting to hear that it's an open conversation. So I want to switch a little bit to how, if people are open to the idea, how do we build these items? So, and what are the challenges? So I'm going to turn over to Kathleen a little bit to talk to us about, you know, why is it so expensive to build affordably priced condos and homes in both Boston, but also throughout Massachusetts?
Thanks. So I'll just also add, at Mass Housing, we have a subsidy program to cover some of the cost of building an affordably priced ownership unit. And some of our very first projects were large projects that had originally been conceived as affordable rentals. And they were thinking, okay, it's a 60-unit project, maybe we make 10 of them ownership. And it was a direct result of those conversations. In the community engagement process, developers were saying, bring 60 units, affordable rentals, and the community was saying, we have your back if you make 10 of them home ownership. So this is a giant conversation and they are being swayed. They just need to make the financing work, which is the hard part. I would say it's not just a problem of making affordable ownership units, of building ownership units. It's a problem of building anything. It's a problem of building anything that will be sold. And we all know, all of us who work in the affordable rental delivery system, that there is so much subsidy necessary to make an affordable rental unit possible to build it. And for a really long time, we haven't had any subsidies to build affordable ownership units. I will say that, you know, we do have, for all the reasons that Lisa talks about zoning, if you see a parcel of land on the market that you could develop, but it's only single family zoning, you're gonna buy it and hold it. And that's expensive to hold it and to go through the design process with an architect. Again, that's expensive. To go through the zoning and permitting is extremely expensive. So this creates barriers about who's going to do this work. And maybe a developer like Dariella doesn't actually have the patient capital to wait 2-3 years to go through all those process, where somebody else could throw something up pretty quickly and without the mission component behind it. Also, for all the reasons that Lisa discussed, you know, the cost to develop a unit in some of the lower market cities, like in Springfield, the cost of the land is actually not that much cheaper. And the cost to build something certainly is not that much cheaper. Lumber is lumber and labor is labor. The issue is that at the end of the day, you could build a unit in Boston and sell it for a market price tomorrow. You could not build a unit in Springfield and sell it and cover your costs because the market isn't there to cover it. So maybe it costs $600,000 to build a unit in Boston. And you could sell it for 800. But if you're building in Springfield, maybe it costs a little less, it costs 500, but you're not going to sell it for more than 200. So those market factors are what really make doing this kind of work, particularly in communities that need it, really, really challenging for developers.
That's such a good point. And I want to ask Dariella, so on that point, so now we're hearing that, well, we might have some land elsewhere, but the costs are maybe the same. So that's putting some pressure, as I think we all know, in the greater Boston region, in particular areas that Emilio and Dariella are working in. And so tell us a bit of your experience of the residents in those neighborhoods as some homeownership opportunities are coming up, what are some of the dynamics you're seeing as a result?
So I think for us, we've been, our first project we were designated was city-owned land, right? So that's been a way that we've been able to mitigate high land costs. So we're really excited about, the mayor's new initiative to release 150 new parcels as well. Because I think, and they're specifically for affordable homeownership. I think that is a way for smaller developers of color like myself and many others that do exist in Massachusetts to sort of get in the door and provide, and at the same time provide homeownership opportunities to the community. So I think the city has also done some work engaging residents around the land that they own already in the city. And again, residents are saying they want affordable homeownership. So I think it's pretty loud, right? It's clear what the community wants and what's needed, specifically in communities of color.
Emilio, I'm going to turn to you on this point. So if we have some community members and residents who are interested in these affordable homeownership opportunities, Urban Edge has been at the cutting edge of engaging with your existing residents on some of the in your rental portfolio with making that bridge into homeownership. Can you just talk to us about some of the challenges, but definitely also the successes of those programs?
Sure. So similar to what already been said, the homeownership challenge is a huge one. It has multiple components. At Urban Edge, what we try to do in our strategic plan is to begin to think about how do we help people become more vibrant. And that means a lot of different things. One, it really means that the typical first-time home buyer class is not the only step, that they actually need ongoing support. And sometimes it may take a year or a year and a half before someone goes from completing a first-time home buying class to actually having all the things in place in order for them to be a homeowner. But what we've also seen is that despite the fact that we have over 600 households who graduate our first-time home buying class on an annual basis, we're seeing a decreasing number of families that are able to afford to buy, whether it's here in Boston or any one of the more affordable suburbs or cities. And part of that has to do with what's already been said, is the increasing costs. And one of the things that what we try to do is, one, is that we have a whole series of what we call wealth building opportunities for both our residents, but also for community members. So for example, what we learned was that many people who come to the first-time home buying class or who come to us for coaching and who may be interested in first-time home buying aren't necessarily the ones that are going to be able to buy within the next year. And so really what they need is really opportunities to learn how to save, opportunities to do career development, to increase their income over time. So we have a whole series of opportunities where, one example is that we allow people to save anywhere between $20 to $100 a month, and then we'll match it if they're able to do it for 12 months, 2-to-1, as a way. And for some people, this is the first opportunity that they're having of creating a savings. But then we have the folks who are potentially, with some additional support over a 3 to 9 month period, could become homeowners. And that's where some of our down payment assistance programs come in, and also what we call the last mile. It's one of the barriers that often exists when people have put everything together. They have an offer that's been accepted, and before they can go to closing, maybe they did an inspection and something comes up, and all of a sudden it could be anywhere between $3,000 to $7,000 that can stop someone who's taken a year or more to be ready to be a homeowner, and they're not going to be able to close on that $500,000 to $600,000 property. So we created what we call the last mile fund as an opportunity to really help people who find themselves in that situation. And for our residents specifically, which we believe it's really one of the big challenges, is that affordable housing residents don't always think or consider homeownership as an option for a number of reasons. But I think the primary reason is that they're not even aware of what it means and what it takes to become a homeowner. And so one of the things we've been doing is educating our own residents who live in the affordable housing that we've developed over the years so that they can understand. And in addition, we said we're going to provide them with $100,000 down payment assistance if they're going to be buying in the Boston area and $50,000 if they're buying outside of Boston, as an incentive to really help people move along. And that coupled with some of the other incentives that are available to the general public. Like, for example, we have programs where we're funded by the city of Boston. If you increase the credit score by a certain amount, that you can get a $5,000 grant to help go towards purchasing a home. So the successes that we've seen have been primarily around, one, shifting the mindset of people who thought homeownership was so far outside their reach, they didn't even want to talk about it. Two is understanding that it's not enough to help people understand what the challenges are and where they may need to do some work. They actually need additional support, whether it be one-on-one coaching or the type of direct assistance that I talked about, down payment assistance, help changing careers and earning more money, being able to save more. But I think it's also this idea that these things don't happen overnight. As the professor said, it's been going on for more than a generation. And we have to be able to commit to these types of things for the long term in order to really begin to see the impact of how additional down payment assistance and other things would help. One thing I would say is that the existing programs like the MHP, 1+ mortgage, a great example of how a program over time has really helped hundreds and hundreds of families become homeowners. Because sometimes people forget that the delta between what allows someone to be a homeowner and not be a homeowner is not as large as you think. But to them, 20, 30, 40,000 is a huge number. But in the aggregate, is it really that huge when we think about what it is that we need?
Exactly. And so just underscore a couple pieces here. So we're talking about, and Amelia is talking about residents in their portfolio who want to be homeowners, okay, right? And again, on the spectrum, we're not talking about everybody. We're not talking about homeownership for everybody. We're talking about households and families who want to be homeowners, but think it's out of their reach, who have just put that idea on a shelf and assumed that they should walk away from that. So we're talking about how to provide that access for those who are ready, near ready, and who want to be homeowners, right? And as you just said, 20, 30, 40,000, well, that is a lot of money. But when compared to the cost of building an affordable rental unit, which would 500,000, right? So if you think of it also, again, on the continuum, we're talking about a household who wants to go in a certain direction, helping them go in that direction, start to build wealth because they want to be there. And now also the home that they are opening, their rental home that they're opening, that's a +1 on the portfolio. So that's again giving another family a home to live in. Okay, so well, that's great. We'll have a lot of residents who are looking to go into home ownership, and we're going to help them. But back to supply. What are we going to do there? Because there aren't that many homes out there that are affordable and reasonably priced. So I'm going to get, send it back to Kathleen again on what do we do? What are there different financial tools that you can tell us about to help home builders build these houses?
Absolutely. So I think, one of the things that we at Mass Housing heard for a really long time, and from our colleagues on the home ownership side of our shop, is that qualified would be home buyers of color with moderate incomes. We're looking to buy homes in primarily the gateway cities in Boston, and there was insufficient supply of homes at a reasonable price for them. We've gone across the state and back again many times talking to the people who lead these cities, and they're saying we actually don't need more affordable rental stock, more income restricted rental stock. We need new units. And the communities are saying we need new units that are an opportunity for us to access to homeownership. So several years ago, we launched the Commonwealth Builder Program, which is up to $250,000 per unit of subsidy directly to developers like Dariella or Emilio at the time that they sell their unit, to cover the difference between that $600,000 to build the unit and an income restricted price that is affordable to a household with moderate income. So there are certain assumptions that are made about what is affordable. We're assuming 30% of their income goes towards their housing costs. And so, you know, developers like Dariella and like Emilio, part of the work we're doing is moving would-be home buyers from this rental language of like, how much do I pay per month, into this ownership language, which is like, how do you break a $300,000 mortgage into these component parts to understand what I'm looking at, and doing all of the work that they're talking about. One of the key components that I'll just touch on that relates to what Amelia was just talking about is this piece of knowledge is power, right? And we as developers, we know how to run a pro forma, and we know how to get a permit and build things. What developers don't always do is think about how to get the folks who need this opportunity ready for this opportunity and aware of this opportunity. So often these units are sold through a lottery process. There are households who don't know the lottery is happening. They don't know that the opportunity exists. So to really put the developers on the hook to do more of that ground game, exactly in the way that Emilio and Dariella have talked about it, but to put all the developers on the hook to do that kind of work. So we have $275 million that we're deploying across the state through this program to incentivize the construction of new units. One of the interesting things developers will always say to us, like, how many 3-bedrooms do I have to do? Does it have to be townhouses or can it be condos? And our response to them was like, you tell me. You should be talking to your community, to the neighborhood, in exactly the way that Dariella is talking about, to understand what is right for the context. We as a state are in a critical supply crisis. We need all the things. We need all the kinds of housing. And we need developers and municipalities to be meaningfully engaged with residents to think about what is the right kind of housing for different contexts, so that we have a better time with these zoning challenges. We can build things.
Okay, so we need more developers like Dariella and Emilio. I'm gonna ask you, Dariella, so if we have some money, sounds like, and we have some ideas on how to build more. Now, I've heard that there might be some problems with building and how this is different from building rental housing. Can you tell us about how building condos, townhomes, single families, how that's different and sometimes a little bit of a hurdle for a developer?
Well, I think I'll start off just piggybacking off of Kathleen's comment. I think it involves a lot of upfront work, right? I think it involves you making sure that the product you're going to build, that there are buyers for it, right? That you're going to that you understand the needs of those buyers, right? Affordable housing buyers are not market buyers, right? So you have to have a clear understanding. You have to go out and engage, right? Which is not typically affordable developer, right? It's like with rental, you build it, they will come, right? That's kind of how we function, right? I come from nonprofit real estate development and doing some light tech projects, and there's not necessarily the need to think about product as much, right? Because there's such a need, so folks will come. With affordable homeownership, you have to shift your thinking. Like you actually have to go out and talk to folks first. We spend a lot of time having focus groups with community members before we even finished our architectural plans, right? Because we needed to understand things down to like countertops, storage. Like, what are the things that people are looking for in an affordable unit? There's also demystifying deed restrictions, right? Because that is a barrier to making sure you can sell a unit, right? Helping folks understand that this is your starter home, right? This is like where you can get into the market, stabilize, and then pass on that opportunity to someone else. So I think that, you know, that's the stuff that I really like. You know, we can go through permits and funding applications and, you know, the usual affordable developer process, but I really enjoy that education piece. We continue to do that. throughout so we start before construction even starts, right? Engaging people, and we engage them throughout the construction process. So we have a list of we have a project going on in Roxbury, which CWB funded, 40 affordable homeownership units that we're overseeing. And we, send out weekly emails to like a group of like 300 neighbors, right? To just help them see our progress, keep them excited about what's happening, and also keeping them aware that it's coming, right? So it's that effort, I think, that that becomes difficult, right? Because it's not necessarily rewarded. There's no incentive to do that, but I think it's a must, right? The other, in terms of technically, I think that there's a lot of financial constraints to building affordable homeownership. I think there's a lot of risk, right? Because it's a fee, it's like your developer fee is what you get, right? So you have to ensure that construction goes well. You have to ensure that like all your ducks are in a row so that you can maximize your developer fee. There is no asset that's going to depreciate and cash flow over time. For developers, this is our one time to realize the fee, and then we have to make sure that we have other projects coming in order to sustain. And with that as well, with homeownership, there's we have construction defect laws, right? So when we build something, again, we have to make sure that it's 100%, because homeowners can come back to us within 6 years, and we have to be responsive to whatever that defect is. That's not something that happens in rental, in the affordable rental world. So I think, there's a lot of reasons why developers shy away from affordable homeownership, but we don't. I think for us, it's important to create the same opportunities that I took advantage of for my neighbors, right? So.
So I just wanted to also clarify one thing about the legal context of this is that when you're creating an affordable home, and it's not just a traditionally market rate home that's sold at whatever price it costs to develop, there's a bunch of legal techniques that we're sort of talking about here that you need to use in order to create that housing. So one of them is there should be a subsidy involved, a subsidy from the government that brings the price of the home down, right? There's legal issues about how that subsidy should be handled, right? So a deed restriction would say that, okay, well, you're gonna have this home, but when you sell it in 10 years, right, you need to either pay a percentage of this subsidy back, or you get to keep the subsidy completely, or you have to sell the unit to someone who's similarly situated 30 years from now. Those are legal conventions that might be put in the development to make it an affordable home ownership development rather than a regular standard home ownership opportunity. And those things have to be legally structured. That's the role of the lawyer. And I think there's a real question here for cities and governments and entities that provide these kinds of subsidies about how best to use them, because the tension is that when you're a low-income homeowner, you need to be able to get into the marketplace initially, and you don't really have the income to do that at a regular market rate way. So the government, and the city, the state, or federal government might need to give you some form of subsidy. But then the idea is you just then get to keep that subsidy. And when you move from the home 10 years later, 20 years later, do you get to sell it at whatever the market rate price is 10 years later, and you benefit from a wealth perspective from that subsidy, right? You're going to be able to sell your home at whatever the market rate is 10, 15 years from now, and you keep all that economic benefit. That's great, and that's really what we want in some ways, because the same people who I was talking about in the beginning of the talk, who were denied the opportunity for homeownership, now want that wealth building opportunity. But the city, in order, they're going to make that same unit affordable again 10 years from now to the next person, they got to put in way more subsidy, right? So if you want to sell a home that went from $100,000 to $200,000, and you want to sell that to someone who can only afford $60,000, you got to put way more money in 10 years later in order to make that same unit affordable to somebody at $60,000. So cities have to keep spending additional money every time someone takes that subsidy unit with them in the form of equity. And it's a balance that cities have to figure out. And that's why some ways in which people have thought about this is to do the traditional model and let the individuals take the subsidy with them and build wealth. But then other cities have thought, well, maybe we own them through something called the community land trust. which means that we can have all the units in our community land trust be somewhat restricted in price, and then when the unit is sold, it's sold back to us, and we then sell it to somebody else at a lower cost, and it's not as much money for us to put in each time. And these are the kinds of considerations, I think, that really have to be weighed when we're talking about affordable home ownership. And this is also an area where, like my students in the class and other people, we need to understand the legalities of this, or else we really can't be helpful to these developers if we don't know how deed restrictions are different, what community land trusts are, how you restrict them, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. That was a great set.
And that's directly in Massachusetts. That's absolutely true. I mean, when we're developing a project in Boston, they're looking for affordability and perpetuity, like minimum appreciation, so that they can actually keep this home affordable and that it is a starter home. I'll say in communities like Holyoke or Springfield or, gateway cities where there's just a lack of supply overall, they're looking for the quickest burn off of that deed rider where it flips to market rate as soon as possible. And that's for, all the urban planning things that they have going on that they're looking. So it's in Boston, we're buying affordability. In Holyoke, it's a production subsidy. That unit wouldn't be built otherwise. And what they need is it's almost an economic development subsidy. It has these diffuse benefits that immediately go out into the community. So it's absolutely different and it's documented completely.
Yeah, and it's a gentrification question, right? If you do it in the Holyoke way, then you're gonna be making the community more affordable for people who can afford more higher rents, and you're gentrifying it in some ways. And if you're doing the other thing, you might be causing a problem where you're keeping it so many low-income people in one place that aren't developing wealth, that's a problem. And so these are the kinds of policy considerations that have to be made.
I mean, this conversation about the wealth building and the equity in affordable homeownership is something that nonprofit developers and other developers who are concerned about community have really been talking about for a while. There's this natural tension that exists where sometimes people think that it's a or when it should be an and. For example, the examples that you just mentioned around the community land trust, having very low restrictions or having more restrictions in the deed. It really depends because, from my perspective and from the work that we've done at Urban Edge, community stability is important. That the goal is not just to help individual families, but to create opportunities for long-standing residents to be able to, if there is gentrification, enjoy and benefit from the economic progress that has occurred. But it's not just for that one family or for that one generation. What happens if some of the inequality that we know will persist, continues to persist? Where will that next generation? And will they be able to purchase a house? And so that's why you see a group of folks who are more about, let's keep the restrictions, let's make sure that you can resell it to someone else who has a similar income 30 years from now. But at the same time, that serves a very specific purpose, but it's only a slice of a solution. Because at the other extreme, you have a situation where the racial wealth gap is so large, as we saw in the charts. It's unconscionable for us not to figure out how do we begin to lessen that racial wealth gap, which is why I think the Commonwealth Builders is an excellent example where in Boston, the deed restrictions were really 30, 40 years and removable. So you pretty much were talking about a lifetime. Even though you did build equity, but it was fairly modest over time. And then the Commonwealth Builders have kind of worked something out where they had engaged in having a 15-year deed restriction. And so the city of Boston is allowing, from my understanding, that folks who are doing those new projects to be able to do the 15-year restrictions. So that's an example of a negotiated compromise that seeks to find the middle ground. Land trusts are a little bit different, and I think they're part of the solution simply because land trusts are seen as community-owned property and land, where it is focused on saying those of us who are at the lowest income, who many may not think should be homeowners, deserve an equal opportunity to be homeowners. Some of the very, very low income folks, and land trusts tend to focus on that category of people. Because right now, if you're building affordable home ownership, at least in Boston, there are certain limitations as to the income that you can target because you need even more subsidy. The lower the income that you want to be able to sell a homeownership property to a family, the more subsidy that you have to be able to bring in order to make the delta smaller and smaller between the cost of building and then the sale price that someone at a particular income range can afford.
I'm gonna touch on a bunch of items here. I'm first gonna say, I know it's a lot, and these are the developers, so they're talking about a lot of numbers. But for the lawyers and budding lawyers in the room, the emphasis here is there's so many needs, so many policies, so many complications that have to be sewn together. That's where you come in. And it's a both and, it's all of these things. It's trying to figure it all out together. And that's why you should come into the field. So that'll be my pitch for that. But we're talking about just so many different ways of approaching this. So I also want to tie in from Monday's discussion. Emilio, you're just talking about, you know, the racial wealth gap. We're talking about the deed restrictions versus having that equity go with the homeowner as they move on to somewhere else. And this might be an example of a really great place where if you could figure out how to have racially conscious policies, which we're not at that point, but if we were, this might be a good point where you would have a decision point in a policy to say, well, for this particular group of people who were discriminatorily impacted, we're going to do something different versus something else. So just to kind of tie a lot of these different concepts that we've been talking about together. Okay. I do want to,
but this like goes back.
You can see how excited we all are, right? I know.
Guys, Lisa's presentation, we actually just closed on a Commonwealth Builder deal in Boston that's right along the Southwest Corridor Park, which was cleared for the highway. And in the preference criteria for those, when those units are sold, there will be a preference for households who were displaced through government activity and clearance. So we're trying to, all those laws that were so restrictive and exclusive and unfair at the outset, we're trying to think about how to repair and come back now through those types of things. So that's very important.
And I was just gonna say, a lot of these questions about how to balance wealth and wealth building and history are gonna be revisited at the conference on Friday on land loss reparations and housing policy in depth as well. So
Yeah.
it's another opportunity to be funded.
Another spot, okay? So I want to just, did you have something that you wanted?
Yeah, I think one thing that we struggle with when developing in our community is, fair housing specifically. Fair housing was made to help, right? And I think in some ways now where we are and where we're trying to, find, all the tools in the toolbox, right? In terms of wealth building, it's becoming a barrier, right? Because we would want to prioritize folks in the neighborhood being able to buy in their neighborhood, folks on their block being able to buy on their own block, but we're not able to. And I think that is like ultimately anti-gentrification, anti-displacement, but we just can't, regulation wise, we can't get there. So we struggle with, making sure we're informing folks of the opportunity and getting out there and making sure they can participate. But it is a challenge, right? We'd love to be able to prioritize just because of our deep roots in these neighborhoods. Like we could just like go block by block and say, hey, this is an opportunity, but we can't.
Everyone's setting up their great segues. So I want to turn over to demand side. We've been talking a lot about supply and policy, and I definitely want to save some time for questions. But so maybe we'll do the demand side quicker than I expected, but I'll send it back to you, Dariella. So you're absolutely right. The Fair Housing Act has had a very ironic turn here, right? And so in the absence of a change to our regulations and the law right now, for those folks who we want to help on the demand side, what are you finding to be the most useful tools for people in the community to be able to buy, for anyone in the room who wants to buy, right?
So we started off as real estate developers and consultants and have added this marketing side to what we do because of this, right? I think we wanted to get out and just talk about homeownership in general and be able to create a pool of local residents that we could then educate on the opportunities that are coming up, and not just our opportunities, right? It's like whatever Urban Edge has coming up, it's like we just want to tell you this is available. And also educate you on what it means to take advantage of it. What are the resources that are out there? What is the 1+ mortgage? What is Mass Dreams? How does this all work together? And what does that translate to monthly payment, right? So we've been talking about, like, everyone's used to talking about rent. So let's talk about homeownership in the same context, right? It's like, what is your monthly payment? Your mortgage all in, this is how much you would pay, not too different from you renting a market rate unit, right? So I think we've been really thinking about how do we, partner with folks like Urban Edge, right? Like we presented at Urban Edge about homeownership opportunities before, so it's like, we just need to get a list of folks so that way we can share opportunities directly with them and they're ready and can take advantage.
Emilio, can you tell us about, I want folks to hear here and virtually, the exciting Urban Edge calculator as you guys have figured out and launched earlier this year. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So part of the work that we do is helping people buy homes. We do that in a number of different ways. As the coaching, we have a brokerage firm that we created called Q that focuses primarily on low to moderate income homeowners, and they're very well skilled along with our staff with all of the various like 1+ mortgage and other types of down payment assistance ORs and that exist throughout the state. But what we also are constantly learning that people don't always have the ability, the kind of choices that they want, and sometimes they make a choice and then the market around them shifts. The best example is looking at the interest rate.
Right.
When we did the soft launch of our wealth building program, we were so excited. We said, okay, we're going to give people $7,500, in order to be able to do down payment system. Our residents would get up to $100, and we slowly began to see a shift. That people who were able to afford at 4% interest rate, that affordability evaporated at 7%. And then it became a question, how best do we use limited resources to potentially help this potential homeowner figure out whether or not it's still possible? And so what we did is we worked, we're a NeighborWorks organization, which is this national membership group. And we worked with, with those colleagues to create a template that would allow us to do some analysis by being able to plug in income, the potential appreciation rates, and other types of, data points to help them figure out, is the best course of action not buying at all and waiting? Or is it to make a choice between, do you increase your down payment assistance? Or is it to really buy down the interest rate? What we found was that in most cases, it's actually buying down the interest rate. Now, the assumption is that people would be, in a high interest rate market, that in 5 to 7 years that they would refinance. And so that's one of the key indicators. And, and we're still working with this because what we're finding is that these interest rates are just taking years and years of work and then creating yet this unexpected barrier that didn't exist a year and a half ago. But for us, because we're committed to this work, it's still about how do we do the workarounds? What other opportunities and what other ways can we help people figure out, despite the higher interest rates, what they can still afford to buy?
So I'm going to kind of close us here, and I realize that that's not that much time on the demand side because I know we have another class coming in and I want to have some time for questions. But this point that Emilio is raising, I think, is exactly where we as policymakers come in. Emilio and I have talked about this idea of, oh my God, the market completely shifted in 12 months. And as I talked about before, it takes a really long time to get programs together, to get them set up and moving. And so what happens when you have a big down payment assistance program that you've set up and you're ready to go and you're really excited about it. But then interest rates just completely shift, and now a down payment assistance doesn't really help you with your monthly mortgage payment anymore, because now you're talking about 7.5%. So at MHP, we've been talking a little bit about the One Mortgage program, and that's a first time home buyer mortgage product and program. We've been talking about One Plus Boston. That's a program in the Boston area that at MHP, we partnered with banks, a certain set of banks. We kind of did all that legwork and building that relationship to have them sign on and say, okay, we'll take this amount of money and we will agree to write down, so decrease the interest rate for these buyers. We will write it down to, in certain cases, up to a percentage point. And we did all that, and that was like a pre-COVID, and it has been very successful, but we were working on that. And then all the interest rates went down. And so I was like, wow, well, this is a great idea. But so these levers need to be able to shift and move very quickly. And so we've been talking about how the Mass Dreams program, which is a statewide down payment subsidy program that came out of the COVID funds, can also be used and move into an interest rate write-down program as well. And to be able to do that, like sort of move quickly based on what the market needs. And that's tough for government and policymakers to do, but that's yet another solution that we're hoping to put into the toolbox over some amount of time. So that's where I'm going to close. I know it's not that much time, and but if anybody does have questions, please bring them. Oh, in the back. For the virtual folks, did you have them, Mike? Oh, well, yes. I'm just gonna ask you to speak into the mic.
So I'm Professor Thomas Mitchell. I'm the director of the Initiative on Land, Housing, and Property Rights. I know a little bit about housing because I'm a professor of these Alexander and all the housing stuff. But the question I have for you is, it sounds like you guys are doing a good job in terms of the front end educating these possible homeowners, which is very distinct from during the Great Recession, where there were so many organizations, powerful organizations like the Ford Foundation, that were all like getting hyped up about homeownership in Black and brown communities, and totally had a blind eye to these exotic mortgages, and and so they had a lot of egg on their face at the end because it wasn't your granddad's mortgage. And then there were hundreds of millions of dollars of loss, both to those homeowners and the collateral damage it caused in the communities that were folks, their individual homes weren't foreclosed. So it's good in terms of the kind of financial education that I heard. But then in terms of additional education, like how to avoid getting into a problematic home equity loan 10 years from now, that could undermine your ownership. And then there's the issue of we have a lot, we talk about the racial wealth gap. Of course, we have tons of racial gaps in our country, but one of the least known is the racial estate planning gap, where Black and brown communities make wills at a rate like 50% less. Like I think in the Black community, the will making rate's like 22%. So then you have, that's not an immediate problem. That might not be a 10-year problem, might not be a 20-year problem, but if that keeps repeating, we result in something called either heirs property or tangled title. That can cause long-term problems within communities, in extreme cases resulting in abandonment. So at Friday's conference, the register for the Philadelphia's Register of Wills is coming, and they're going to talk about the interaction between these gang violence and gun violence and heirs property. So anyway, so what outside of that initial kind of education do you do education about avoid a problematic home equity loan, do estate planning? So what is the time frame?
Sure. I think a lot of what you're talking about is commonly known as the post-purchase counseling. We do some of that, but some of the things that you mentioned are not things that we currently do. But these are things that we talked about and are trying to figure out. One specific example is at a previous organization that also did affordable homeownership and housing, that we did something called Keeping the Family. which is really targeted because this was in Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. You know, historically Black community that was going through significant gentrification. And the idea was that we have low to moderate income individuals who bought homes 30 years ago for 10, 20,000, and now those homes are worth $1 million. And so the idea of being able to bring together a state attorney, property managers, insurance folks to help them understand how they need to think differently around the asset that they own and to start thinking about the future, because I can't tell you how many examples I know of children who have inherited homes. And then within 2 to 3 years, they've lost that home. And it's because people don't have the kind of education around estate planning and doing the thinking about what happens when I'm no longer around to take care of this property that I've had for so many years.
One other thing to add, in Massachusetts, as of like 3 years ago, there were 19 different deed riders on these kinds of affordable restricted housing. They all had different provisions about capital appreciation, capital improvements, about resale and inheritance. So the state is really trying to clean up that issue. There's also just legal documentation things, like this is more your bailiwick than mine. But you know, about when you would go to take out a home equity loan, a lot of times they wouldn't see the deed restriction. So homeowners would borrow well beyond the restricted value, and then they're absolutely underwater. So the documentation at the outset is getting better, and there is a lot of attention on the things we're talking about. The one other thing about transferring properties, historically, you can only transfer a deed restricted unit to your heir or descendant if they also income qualify, which again flies a little bit in the face of about intergenerational wealth building. So that's one of the things that in our negotiations that Emilio mentioned with the city of Boston, to say that the restriction can stand. But if you can pass this to your child, regardless of their income qualification, that's really important. So we're trying to put the scaffolding around it and do a better job at the outset.
We have time for one more. Somebody. Right. I am is the sitting city councilor involved in this. And the boss.
Hi, everyone. As Lucy said, I'm Ryan with you all. I'm also on the city council of Malden. I represent a formerly red line area. I'd like to thank the panelists as well as us for bringing this to Boston College Law School. And, you know, it means a lot to me. One of the questions I have is, you know, obviously as we talked about financing public housing or affordable housing, homeownership opportunities is very challenging. We talked about reparations. I wasn't aware that there was going to be this conference. I look forward to it. Obviously, government had a role in that. What role do you think private entities that helped disinvest affordable housing in the past have in funding future affordable housing?
So I guess I'd answer. I mean, I think the reality is they don't have a responsibility, like they don't have one legally. I think they do have one morally, and it's one of the areas where I think sort of ESG and socially responsible investing as a private new development is a really important one, because that means that private entities and investors can weigh other considerations besides just the market rate return that they get on an investment in making an investment. And so sometimes they might say, okay, we're going to get a decent return on this economically, but there's social environmental reasons, there's past social justice reasons, there's creating markets that will sustain the next generation reasons that we might make this investment. And if they're restricted by only providing an economic and financial return to their investors, then the answer to your question is they have no incentive. But if they are actually thinking about their investment model more comprehensively to include other factors, then I think those are the kinds of entities that really could be funding these alternatives and homeownership.
And I'll just add very quickly to this point specifically, no legal obligation, but there are so many lenders out there who are looking to do special purpose credit programs. And those are permitted to have different kinds of loan terms for particular classes, if it's demonstrated that there's a social or economic disadvantage or among a shared characteristic. And there are a lot more details for young budding lawyers to learn about and to help in this industry of creating more special purpose credit programs. So you may have known in the news, there are more and more happening. So I think that there would be more advocacy and trying to make those easier to create and market would be a great path into allowing the private lending, for-profit and nonprofit community into this conversation.
So I just want to say first, thank you to Danielle Kinkel for being an amazing Rappaport Senior Fellow over these past. And Emilio and Kathleen and Danielle for helping teach us, educate us, inform us about the world of actual, possible, potential, affordable homeownership. For many of you here, you now know there are some tools and techniques that you can avail yourselves of. And you now have some people with whom you can connect to maybe purchase your first home. So thank you all so much.